Garden, the change hit him like a physical blow. The familiar burst of color was gone. The warm blanket of white roses that had embraced the central fountain had been stripped away, replaced with uniform rows of neatly trimmed hedges. The forget-me-nots, his mother's flowers, were nowhere to be seen. The bronze plaque, small but irreplaceable, was missing. The soft hum of bees and the gentle sway of blooms in the breeze had been replaced by the sterile stillness of a royal display garden. For a long moment, William simply stood there, his hands at his sides. The palace staff watched from a careful distance, their silence heavy with things they could not say. His gaze moved slowly across the altered space, and in that stillness, a flood of memories surged forward, walking through the garden with Harry on the day of the statue unveiling, seeing Catherine's gentle smile as she laid the first bloom at the fountain, hearing the quiet applause of well-wishers who had come to honor his mother's life. All of it felt stolen. His jaw tightened, but it was his eyes that betrayed him. The cool blue, so often steady and composed, clouded with something raw. Not anger, but a deep, aching sorrow. He took a step toward the fountain, his polished shoes crunching softly on the gravel, and reached down to touch the edge of the basin. The cool stone felt foreign now, as if it belonged to another place entirely. A single white rose lay on the ground, discarded by one of the gardeners who had been too rushed, or too heartbroken, to carry it away. William bent to pick it up, cradling it in his hand as though it were a fragile relic. The petals were bruised from their uprooting, but their scent remained, delicate and familiar. He closed his eyes briefly, drawing in that scent like a final trace of his mother's embrace. When he looked up, his gaze swept past the staff and toward the upper palace windows. He knew, without needing confirmation, whose decision had set this in motion. And though he said nothing, the silence that followed was louder than any outburst could have been. In that moment, William made a silent vow. The garden would return, whatever it cost. The public outcry it began quietly with a single photograph. A palace visitor, unaware of the brewing storm, had snapped an image of the Sunken Garden during a scheduled tour and uploaded it to social media. The picture was harmless in isolation, until those who knew the garden well noticed what was missing. Gone were the lush banks of white roses, the delicate borders of forget-me-nots. In their place stood sterile hedging and regimented plantings, the kind that could belong to any palace in Europe. Within hours, royal watchers began to compare before and after images. The contrast was undeniable, and the speculation swift. Words like desecration and erasure began to appear in comment threads. Some thought it a mistake, an unfortunate seasonal change. Others, more suspicious, recalled past tensions between the Prince of Wales and the Queen Consort. The whispers grew sharper. By evening, the story had escaped the confines of online fan groups and entered the broader media. Tabloids published side-by-side photographs with headlines that asked, "Who ordered the change?" Columnists invoked Diana's name with reverence, reminding readers that the garden was not just a public attraction, it was her son's chosen tribute, a space born of love and loss. Petitions began to circulate. "Restore Diana's garden quickly," gathered tens of thousands of signatures, drawing support from both lifelong royalists and those who had long been skeptical of the monarchy. Across the Atlantic, American morning shows picked up the story, their hosts shaking their heads in disbelief. "Why touch it at all?" one anchor asked, her voice tinged with frustration. What inflamed the public even further was the palace's silence. Official channels issued no clarification, no acknowledgement of the change. Requests for comment were met with the same vague phrase, "The palace does not comment on internal matters." To many, that was confirmation enough that something deliberate had occurred, and that someone in power wanted it that way. In the absence of facts, narratives flourished. Some claimed it was part of a modernization initiative. Others believed it was a personal move, a calculated attempt to diminish Diana's symbolic presence in palace life. The more Camilla's name appeared in these theories, the more the tension between the two royal camps deepened. Even those who rarely involved themselves in royal affairs found themselves unsettled. The idea that a memorial space created by a grieving son for his mother could be altered without his consent struck at something deeply human. It wasn't about titles, crowns, or protocol. It was about respect. By the end of the week, the Sunken Garden was no longer just a quiet corner of Kensington Palace. It had become a battleground in the public imagination, a symbol of a legacy under siege. And behind the palace gates, the man at the heart of that legacy was preparing for a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Behind palace doors, the palace at night is not the glittering fairy tale of postcards. After the last camera flash fades and the public gates close, the corridors fall into a hush that carries every footstep like a whisper. It was in this quiet, the kind that seems to watch you, that Prince William requested a private meeting. The guest list was short: senior courtiers, a handful of aides, and the two people at the center of the storm. Camilla arrived first. Dressed in her usual understated elegance, she carried herself with the calm of someone who has faced decades of public scrutiny and survived it. Her expression betrayed nothing, though her posture, chin slightly higher, shoulders a touch more rigid, suggested she was prepared for a battle. When William entered, there was no formal greeting. He moved to the head of the table, his presence filling the room not with volume, but with a stillness so heavy that even the ticking of the clock seemed intrusive. Those who knew him well could read the signs: the squared jaw, the measured breathing, the eyes that held their focus just a second too long. The opening words were clipped. He wanted to know who had authorized the alterations to the Sunken Garden and why it had been done in his absence. The courtiers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two royals. Eventually, it was Camilla who spoke, her voice level and deliberate. She framed the changes as part of a necessary modernization of palace grounds, aligning them with a broader vision of uniformity and formal presentation. "We must think of the monarchy's image as a whole," she said, each word polished like a well-rehearsed line. To her, the garden was beautiful, but overly personal. A space too tied to a single narrative, one that risked overshadowing the present and pulling the institution back into the past. William listened without interruption, but the tightening of his grip on the armrest betrayed him. When he finally responded, his voice was quiet, but the weight behind it silenced the room. He reminded her that the garden was not a PR ornament, nor a relic to be managed. It was his mother's legacy, entrusted to him and Harry. Altering it without their consent was not modernization. It was erasure. Charles, seated between them, looked down at his folded hands, as though the grain of the table might offer an escape. His silence was deafening, his neutrality impossible to miss. In that moment, William understood something he had long suspected. When forced to choose between his wife and his son, the king would always choose the path of least resistance. The meeting ended without agreement, without apology, without even the polite fiction of a shared resolution. Camilla left with the same measured grace she had entered with, her head high. William remained behind, standing at the window and looking out into the darkness beyond the palace gates. Somewhere beyond those walls, the altered garden sat under the night sky, stripped but not forgotten. And in that quiet, he made a promise to himself: the roses would return. A legacy. Under siege autumn settled over Kensington Palace with a kind of indifferent beauty, the trees burning gold and copper, the air carrying the faint sweetness of fallen leaves. From a distance, the Sunken Garden still looked immaculate. The hedges were trimmed, the pathways swept, the fountain polished to perfection. But for those who knew, perfection was not the same as wholeness. Where once white roses had spilled in soft abundance, there was now precision and symmetry. The forget-me-nots, once tiny blue stars along the garden's edge, had vanished entirely. The space remained orderly, dignified, but it no longer breathed. It no longer felt like hers. William visited less often now. When he did, it was at quiet hours, early dawn, or the cool edge of evening, when the palace grounds were nearly empty. He would stand near the fountain, hands behind his back, and simply look. Some days he would close his eyes and remember the way it used to be. Catherine's gentle laughter as she bent to smell a bloom, Harry running his hand over the petals during their reunion, the cameras flashing the day they unveiled the statue. And always, in the center of those memories, his mother's smile. The public's anger had not faded. Petitions still circulated. Letters still arrived in careful, looping handwriting from people who had never met Diana but felt they knew her. "Bring back her garden," they wrote. "Don't let them take her from us again." Inside the palace, the issue remained a closed matter. For now. But William's vow had not wavered. Time in the monarchy moves slowly, but it moves. And in that slowness lies opportunity. For as long as the memory of Diana lived in the hearts of her sons, the Sunken Garden's true form was never truly gone. One day the roses would return, the forget-me-nots would bloom again. And when they did, they would do more than restore a garden. They would reclaim a promise. Because some legacies, no matter how threatened, cannot be erased. Not by time, not by power, not by anyone.